Cincinnati Bengals, Philadelphia Eagles in Week 8. Which team can avoid a tie and come out on top? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, football fans, and welcome back to another Locked On Crossover on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we're going to be taking our first look at the Cincinnati Bengals Philadelphia Eagles game coming up in Week 8 in Cincinnati. I'm Jake Lisco, along with James Rapien from the Locked On Bengals podcast, today with Louis DiBiase from Locked On Eagles, as we will break down all the biggest stories with each team, the keys to victory, and the weird recent history where 2 out of the last 4 games these teams have played have ended in ties. And I don't think either team is interested in a tie this weekend. As always, Crossover Thursday is presented by Prize Picks, where you can download the app, use promo code LOCKEDONNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. And Louis, let's start, as we do, with the visiting Philadelphia Eagles. Some drama perhaps around this team right now, but a solid victory in their most recent game. What's the biggest story going on right now with that talented Philadelphia Eagles offense?
Yeah, after the bye week, it felt like the sky was falling at 2-2, a blowout loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We were talking about Nick Sirianni being on the hot seat. Is Jalen Hurts the answer? He has regressed in 2 straight years since their Super Bowl run of 2022. And then they won 2 straight games, albeit against the Cleveland Browns and the New York Giants. But it does feel like they've gained some momentum here. And I feel like they have found their identity, even if it's not ideal, considering the money they're investing in the passing game. This football team has realized over the last 2 games, if they don't turn over the football and they run the ball behind Saquon Barkley and an elite offensive line, if that's what they feature and Jalen Hurts plays a clean game, even if it's not elite, they have so much talent on offense, and the defense is really picking up with a lot of young prospects over the last month that they can win a lot of football games that way. But this is a much bigger test, and they haven't faced a Joe Burrow caliber quarterback or this kind of offense since, I would say, week 1, and I wouldn't even say Green Bay is with Cincinnati in that way, but it's the closest with Jordan Love. So I think for Philly, 2 straight of 4-2, the question is now, is this for real, or was it just they played 2 bad teams? But the identity part, I think, was a big win for this team to realize who they are over 2 weeks, because before that, the game plans just always felt like the coaches didn't know what to do with this personnel.
Yeah, I think when you land a Saquon Barkley in free agency, and I'm sure Eagles fans were thanking Giants fans in the offseason when it happened, but certainly last week during that blowout loss when Saquon nearly topped his career high in rushing yards, it's easy to see that identity. And I think that's what the Bengals are most leery of, is as much as it's Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. When Saquon gets going, it makes this offense so tough, nearly impossible to stop, because it opens up the long ball to A.J. Brown and all the things we've seen over the past couple of weeks.
No, I totally agree. And I think Jalen Hurts as well, he plays better when the Eagles have a lead. When he's playing behind, when he feels almost panicked and has to start playing hero ball, that's where you've seen the turnovers come. This is the first time in a long time he's gone multiple games without throwing an interception or fumbling. Since the beginning of 2023, Jalen Hurts has more turnovers than any quarterback, and that was becoming a major problem. A lot of that was because the Eagles don't score points in the first quarter. Like, that's just what happens. It's close games. A lot of the time they're trailing, and Hurts needs to play catch up, and that kind of rushes his clock, and that's when he starts making mistakes. So I think the run game helps control that, build leads, have time of possession. So run it behind number 26. Again, it's not ideal, I think, in the long term, but for 2024, that's when this Eagles team is best.
Interestingly, these teams share their most 2 recent opponents, Browns and Giants, in reverse order. That is a fun little coincidence, as the teams are riding a win streak against 2 of the worst teams in the NFL into a game in which they'll face each other. A fun idiosyncrasy of the schedule there. Talking about that rushing offense, so for the Giants, interestingly, that's a place where the Bengals have stepped up recently. And so despite what we feared against a couple of teams that wanted to run the ball, the Bengals have been better there. That will be interesting to see when we talk about the matchups in a little bit more detail. Let's flip to the other side of the ball, though, Louis. And when I look at this Eagles defense, I am looking squarely at that defensive line and that pass rush, although there's certainly more talent at cornerback with 2 draft picks this year than perhaps you would otherwise think if you're on the outside looking in, especially. Is there a bigger story in this game for you on the Eagles defensive side of the ball than that pass rush?
No, because it was the biggest problem for the first month of the season. Bryce Huff looked like one of the worst free agent signings of the offseason. Vic Fangio had no idea how to use him. Eagles fans were wondering if we could trade for Hassan Reddick back, and the NFL rule is that they can't for 2 years, so we now know that. But it was that bad, and Josh Sweat just looked like a guy, and Nolan Smith, we were wondering if it was a first-round bust. Jordan Davis wasn't taking that next step as a pass rusher on top of his, I would say pretty good run-stopping ability at nose tackle. It was really just Jalen Carter. The last 2 games, the floodgates have opened. They had 8 sacks against the Giants. They had 5 against the Cleveland Browns, 13 total in 2 weeks, and everybody's getting in on the action. So it does feel like maybe we jumped the gun on a lot of these young players and counted them out. But I also think Vic Fangio now has a good idea of what guys can do and what they can't. For instance, Bryce Huff was somebody he was lining up as a stand-up, kind of an outside linebacker, an overhang type of player like he used Hassan Reddick, would even almost drop him back in coverage, use him in obvious run situations. But when Bryce Huff was best with the New York Jets, he had his hands in the dirt, and his one job was to go get the quarterback. That's what Fangio's having him do the last 2 games. And in the last 2 games, he has, I think, 6 or 7 pressures and a sack and a half. So I think Fangio also just has a better understanding of his personnel. So they're cooking up front right now, and hopefully they can keep that momentum going.
Yeah, obviously that's the main concern. Something, excuse me, Joe Burrow talked about certainly on Wednesday during his press conference. Jake mentioned the secondary, and someone on Locked On Bengals that we talked about a lot pre-draft was Quinyon Mitchell. You end up with Quinyon Mitchell in Philly and Cooper DeJean, 2 first-round corners essentially. You get them in rounds 1 and 2. Plus, you revamp that secondary a bit more by bringing back a familiar face in C.J. Gardner-Johnson. What have those 3 guys, I know DeJean just returned, but what have those 3 guys brought to that back end? Because I know that was an issue last season.
No, yeah, and I want to credit my co-host, Gino Camilleri, for this. He put it perfectly. Cooper DeJean seems like he was the missing piece of this defense. Quinyon Mitchell has been incredible all year. Is 3rd in the league right now in forced incompletions. And he's had some tough opponents like Mike Evans and Amari Cooper. This past week, Malik Neighbors didn't do much. But Avonte Maddox in the slot, he was a problem. There were mismatches where bigger receivers were eating him up. When it comes to run fits, he was not doing well in that area or tackling. Cooper DeJean has come in the last 2 games and quietly has the 4th highest coverage grade of any corner in that span, at least according to Pro Football Focus. So he's been a good punt returner as well. The Eagles suddenly, last year, they looked old and slow in the secondary. When you now add DeJean to Quinyon Mitchell, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's been a lot better the last few games. Reed Blankenship has your only 2 interceptions. Suddenly you have 4 or 5 really good young corners. And the best part is they have speed. That was the thing last year. Teams were just blowing by the secondary with the likes of James Bradbury and Kevin Byard. They were just old and slow. And I think now, heading into a game like this against a Jamar Chase and a T. Higgins, you're going to need that kind of personnel. So it's been a nice revelation. And Howie Roseman finally drafted defensive backs high in the draft, and it's paying dividends.
Some very fun matchups there that you're starting to get the idea of as you listen to the personnel on both sides of the ball. Some of the trench matchups will be fascinating and could potentially determine the game, whether or not this young, outside of Darius Slay, obviously, cornerback group with the Philadelphia Eagles can handle the Jamar Chase T. Higgins tandem. These are things that we'll surely be talking about when we eventually get to Keys to Victory. But coming up next, we will get into the biggest stories that we're talking about with the Cincinnati Bengals, and we'll continue with this Crossover Thursday.
Today's show is brought to you by Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink by ZBiotics. It's the world's first genetically engineered probiotic, and it was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. So Eagles fans, if you're coming to town, Bengals fans, if you're planning on going to Paycor, well, you need to do this probably if you feel like you're going to consume a few adult beverages on Sunday. You drink the pre-alcohol for best results. You drink it before you have that first drink. So if you're tailgating early, it's a 1:00 game, they moved it. You'll want to drink this in the morning. Pace yourself, hydrate, get a good night's sleep, and you wake up feeling refreshed and ready to take on the day. You can go to zbiotics/LockedOnNFL to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On NFL promo code at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money. No questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL. That's zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL at checkout for 15% off.
Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles, Locked On Bengals your first listen each and every day. It's Crossover Thursday. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Jake Liskow and James Rapien for Crossover Thursday. Eagles, Bengals, a 1 o'clock kickoff. Now the game was actually flexed, was supposed to be a national TV game. I don't know if you guys are surprised by that. I think considering the game they picked, I'm surprised. The Eagles and Bengals were, I still think, are considered two of the most talented teams in football. So I thought at least for that reason, they are underperforming this year, but they would have stayed in that spot. The Bengals have won 2 straight, though. The Eagles have won 2 straight. It looks like they're kind of back. Do you guys believe that, or is it just kind of a situation where they've been playing just inferior opponents, kind of like the Eagles have?
It feels like they're back.
Yeah.
But they haven't done enough to completely get that Locked On Bengals stamp of approval. I think that's the best way to put it, because there's a path. I mean, they've lost 4 games by a total of, 15 points, Jake? I believe it was. And so when you look at it and you look how they lost some of these games, you can easily see, oh, well, they could be 4-3 or 5-2. At the same time, you're right, Louis. The who they beat over the past 2 weeks isn't going to inspire you either. And it's in reverse order, the Giants and then the Browns, both on the road. The Browns, a tough matchup for them defensively. And so I do think that they're a good football team, but they still have to go out and climb themselves all the way out of the hole to show that and to prove that. And that's what Sunday is about for me. I think that's the biggest thing going into this game, is show everyone that as talented as this Eagles team is, now that you're returning home, they haven't won a game at home at Paycor this year. I'm here at Paycor right now. They're 0-3. Win a home game, beat a really talented team that's won back-to-back games and is pretty hot coming in as well. We'll see if they can do it. But, they're on the right track, but it's a big test on Sunday.
And on the offensive side of the ball, show that you can beat what on paper looks like a defense that's a tough matchup for you. They've faced a couple of defensive coordinators the last couple of weeks that have had their number in the last few years. Shane Bowen, previously with the Titans. Locked On Bengals fans have heard me talk about this a lot in the last few days. And then Jim Schwartz with the Browns has given them fits over the last 3 games against the Browns. Vic Fangio, the last time these teams played, was still running things in Denver. That was a 15-10 game. And so some low-scoring performances against these DCs with good pass rushes and solid coverage in the back end and good corners. The Bengals need to show, like they did last year in this very week against San Francisco, that, no, we're actually still good. And we're going to remind everybody of that. And then one other thing I wanted to mention, Louis, you mentioned that they flexed it. They actually, I think, flexed it to get more eyes on it. It is the quote-unquote national 1 o'clock game where most of the country will be seeing that game at 1 o'clock.
That's fair. That's a good point. I do think the Bengals, I mean, from an outside perspective, yeah, obviously they beat the Panthers, the Giants, the Browns, kind of like the Eagles, not like super impressive wins. But for me, like, I did watch that game against Kansas City, watch the game against Baltimore. You know, you would say those are the 2 best teams in the AFC right now. I think the majority of the consensus would be that that's the case. And you could probably make the case the Bengals kind of choked that away with the penalty and then the muffed, it was the kick, right? The field goal in overtime. So, I mean, they're a couple wins away from being like, yeah, the Cincinnati's not only back, but they're one of the best teams in the league. I know I don't love doing that because you could say that about the Eagles too. They're a Saquon drop away from beating the Falcons and being 5-1. But I do think both teams have shown, like, yes, are they the 2021 Bengals, the 2022 Eagles? Maybe not yet, but they had the talent to get back there at any moment. And I'm curious how you guys feel about that from like the defensive perspective for Cincy.
Yeah, I think that's a huge discussion, right? Can this defense, and they've been better the past 2 weeks. And that's no one really questions Joe Burrow, right? Or Jamar Chase or T. Higgins. We kind of know this defense. They were awful in weeks 3 through 5. They were the reason the Bengals went 1-2 during that stretch where Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins was going, and that they couldn't get any pressure on Jaden Daniels. He was just standing in the pocket, waiting and waiting and waiting until he had someone open, and they literally could not stop him. It was similar against Lamar Jackson, and you could say, all right, well, that's Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson. Okay, you still need to be able to get a stop a couple of stops, especially in that week 3 matchup against Washington. And they didn't. The past couple of weeks, they've gotten healthier up front. BJ Hill's made a big impact. Sheldon Rankins has returned, and those guys have made a difference. Obviously, Trey Hendrickson leads the defense. He is their number 1 player on defense, and probably the 3rd best player on the team, 2nd best player, whatever you want to say, behind Burrow. And so they have pieces. There are still questions, and this is by far their biggest test in a few weeks, dealing with that Saquon Barkley explosiveness and that rushing attack with A.J. Brown over the top and Devontae Smith being able to do a little bit of everything. So the defense, I don't know, Jake, how you feel, but to me, huge question still going into Sunday. And this is their biggest test since they've gotten healthy up front. And obviously they've been better since they've been healthy.
Yeah, like can Trey Hendrickson take over versus former Bengal Fred Johnson at left tackle? Yeah, he can. If they can get the Eagles into a drop back passing situation, which is still scary because, there's A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith out there to hurt you. And Jalen Hurts has been able to deliver to those guys, and maybe not as consistently as Eagles fans would like this year or maybe last year, but we've seen them do it with those guys. We know A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are really good players. We know that the secondary has been embattled, although better in recent weeks. So there's a whole lot going on there, right? Like, can they get the Eagles into a drop back passing situation in the first place? And then do they win the pass rushing matchups when they have them? Those are 2 big ifs for this Bengals defense this week.
And my last question would be too, because I think it's funny, the similarities between the Eagles and the Bengals, like both nearly won a Super Bowl. I don't think people think the window's closed because they have so much talent, young quarterbacks that some would say have been the best in the league over the last few years. Although I'd make the case for Hurts. It's a little bit different right now than for Burrow, who I don't think he's the problem at all in Cincinnati. But again, they kind of rely on a lot of star power on offense. The defense has been up and down. What's your guys' situation when it comes to coaching? Because in Philly, like that's been the talk of the city. It normally is, whether it's justified or not. But I think it's been justified this year with Nick Sirianni, for better or worse. Yeah. Like the guy's been getting a lot of heat this year. What is it like in Cincinnati for Zach Taylor and that staff? Has that been part of the problem, or has that been a good part of the equation?
No, I think a mixture. Certainly. Yeah. I mean, there were times, the Baltimore game, for example, deciding to run it 3 straight times and settle for a field goal, some of the game management stuff. We've talked a lot on Locked On Bengals about the play calling, both good and bad, I would say. And so there's been a mixture. But just judging from afar, I would say that Nick Sirianni's seat is much hotter than Zach Taylor's. Part of that is the organization in just that process of things. But yeah, I do think there's some pressure there, especially after how they started 0-3 and 1-4. And so the response the past couple of weeks has alleviated that some. But I know that a lot of our listeners are probably hearing me say that and listening and saying, man, no, I'm mad. So he definitely takes some heat from fans as well.
I think that the seat is hotter with fans than it is with the organization by a chasm. The difference, the organization, as James alluded to, in Cincinnati, notoriously patient, sometimes often, perhaps to a fault.
Now that's one thing where there's no similarity between Philadelphia and Cincinnati.
None.
Right.
None.
The way they
who can attest to that is new Reds manager Tito Francona. Yeah. Terry Francona knows firsthand the difference between Philly and Cincy or Cleveland.
There's a huge difference there for sure.
One of several. The other big one is money management and cap strategy between the Eagles and the Bengals. I don't know if people heard me say that while you guys were talking before, but that's another big difference. Although, like, from a talent perspective, from an expectations perspective, there are a lot of ways where these teams do mirror each other. It's obviously never an exact comparison in the NFL. There's too many nuances to really say that, oh yeah, the Eagles are the NFC Bengals or the Bengals are the AFC Eagles, but it's close enough that you could make a pretty good argument, I think, for those claims. Along those lines, let's get to some of the biggest matchups in this game and into some of those nuances that probably separate these teams a little bit. We'll finish the show with the biggest keys to victory for each team coming up next.
Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, and they're sponsoring Crossover Thursday today. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you place your bets. Maybe it's the over on, it's a two-leg parlay of the over on A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith receiving yards, or might be the other side. You might bet on the other duo of T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Regardless of what you bet, all you got to do is bet $5. You're going to get $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed win or lose. Take the Eagles or Bengals money line. Lots of player props and team overall bets to take over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So once again, for $5, just place a $5 bet. You're going to get $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed at FanDuel.com.
As we dive into the biggest matchups between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Cincinnati Bengals in this crossover episode on the Locked On Podcast Network, brought to you by Prize Picks, where you can use the app and promo code Locked On NFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5 with Prize Picks. We will discuss the biggest things that have to go right, and we will start, Louis, with those Philadelphia Eagles. If you could pick 3 things that if they happen, the Eagles win on Sunday, what are the top priorities for that team?
Yeah, I think they have to, and this one's obvious for our viewers and listeners, but they have to start fast. They have to finally, they're the only team in football that hasn't scored a point in the first quarter. And with the talent they have, that's just unbelievably unacceptable. So they need to start faster and build a lead so they can be based on their run attack. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the show, that is this identity, whether people like it or not. They want to be a pass-first team. They're a run-first football team. So they need to build a lead and control time of possession. I'd say number 2, you got to protect Jalen Hurts. Like last week, that game was close early on against the Giants because Fred Johnson, who Bengals fans are familiar with, he was not holding up against Brian Burns. Jalen Hurts was struggling with simulated pressure. They've got to hold up front. You're going to be without 2 starters, likely Mekhi Becton and still Jordan Mailata. So I'd say that's number 2. And then number 3 is contain Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Like that battle between those two and Quinyon Mitchell and Darius Slay, that's just such an important part of this game. The Eagles have been really good this year on defense of not letting big plays happen behind them. That's got to continue. This is a much bigger test, though, than what they're used to so far in 2024.
Yeah, I'm excited to see Quinyon Mitchell against these receivers.
It's a great battle. Yeah.
Going back to pre-draft, I mean, we talked a lot about him, Jake, and obviously the Bengals got Amarius Mims, and that's awesome. You get a right tackle, you do it. Mm-hmm. But I didn't think he would fall to 18. I was like small school corner, whatever. He checks every other box. And he fell past 18, obviously. And so, yeah, when we were talking about it, it's like, yeah, if Quinyon falls. And so the fact that he's off to a great start doesn't surprise me at all. And the way T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are playing, that's going to be a heck of a battle.
And I wonder if they continue to try to exploit the slot matchup there. Not that Cooper DeJean has been bad by any means, but if those guys are holding up on the outside and they're clouding the outside or they're clouding Jamar, which teams do, they're just not giving you one-on-ones with Jamar Chase more than twice a game. And Joe Burrow often finds those in the twice per game, and they usually will bite opposing defenses when they get those opportunities. But beyond that, if those guys do hold up, as you're talking about, that is a key for the Eagles side of things. They are moving Jamar Chase into the slot at the highest rate, I believe, of his career so far this year. We saw T. Higgins score a touchdown last week when they got him into the slot. And so when they identify those opportunities to work those guys in the slot from time to time, I think that'll be interesting. And if they continue to do this reverse wishbone thing they got to last week, where they're putting 3 guys behind the line of scrimmage with Joe Burrow, a couple tight ends and a running back to try to condense the box and open things up for T. Higgins and Jamar Chase from a schematic perspective with those corners that you're talking about, Louis, I think that'll be pretty interesting too.
Yeah, and real quick on that too, the Eagles normally don't shadow, like they don't have a corner just follow a receiver all game. But because Cooper DeJean has inside-out versatility, like he was an outside corner pretty much his entire career at Iowa, I would almost love to be like, hey, if I'm Vic Fangio, Quinyon, you're on Jamar Chase all game. And obviously this team's different because they have 2 stud receivers. But I don't know. I would kind of like that. That's kind of my defensive mindset. They're probably not going to do that. But DeJean does have that versatility, so it provides you some more optionality. So I'm very curious to see what Fangio, because he's been a lot more aggressive, playing more man coverage than he was the first month of the year. I wonder if he goes back to kind of more that conservative approach he had in coverage, at least the first month of the season. So that's going to be a fun chess match.
Well, if they can hold up in man,
Yeah.
you can take things away from the Bengals. Like, they rely on their receivers being able to beat man, and teams thus are generally afraid to play it. But the Browns, maybe not as much in this most recent week where there's more man than we're used to, but last year would play a lot of man, and then their corners would hold up, and the Bengals offense looked kind of rough in that challenge. But that will be interesting to see what Fangio's approach is. He obviously has he's got some familiarity with this personnel from Cincinnati from a previous matchup, even if it was a few years ago. James, let's talk about the Bengals side of things. When you're thinking about the Bengals' keys to victory, you might echo Louis in some regards, but what are the three things that have to go right for the Bengals to win in the whiteout?
A lot of people in Cincinnati are talking about pressure and defense and all of those things. But number one is protecting Joe Burrow. Don't let that front. Louis said it earlier in the show, 13 sacks the past 2 weeks. You have to protect Joe Burrow, keep him upright. The Bengals are going to throw the ball. He needs to be able to be upright to throw the ball. Number two, you certainly want to contain Saquon Barkley, because if you can't contain Saquon Barkley and he's getting those explosive runs, it's going to open up everything else. The deep ball to A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith running across the middle or running a deep post, or all of those things that we've seen those guys do at such a high level. And then number three, this defense has forced big plays. Last week, 2 interceptions, 4 sacks, 11 quarterback hits. The Fred Johnson factor is a big one. Take advantage of that, exploit that. And if you're limiting Saquon, then you should be able to get pressure on Jalen Hurts and take advantage of that. So I think those are the three things. If you're protecting Joe Burrow, the offense should find enough out there, enough big plays or enough plays to win. And then it's all on the defense to slow Saquon down, eliminate those explosives, and create some big plays to get the ball back in the offense's hands.
Yeah, I would say if there is one matchup that can make or break this game, it really is Fred Johnson against Hendrickson. Like, the only reason that game kind of got out of hand was because Brian Burns got hurt. Kellen Moore was not doing a good job of giving Johnson help. Like, there weren't a lot of tight ends helping with any sort of chip blocks, running backs. So they got to have a better plan for Hendrickson, or Jalen Hurts. Like, he could be in for a long day. That's going to be an interesting matchup to watch.
I think that if Trey goes into game record mode, you said you watched the Kansas City game back in week 2, the Kansas City-Cincinnati game. That was a game that Trey Hendrickson nearly won on his own.
Yeah.
And if he can do that in a game, again, different offensive mentalities, I think, from the Eagles and the Chiefs. But if he gets to pin his ears back, then he can win games on his own. We've seen him do that in Cincinnati. I know he's not the household name of a Myles Garrett or a TJ Watt or name your favorite pass rusher, but he has affected the quarterback at roughly that level. And I think that's something that many don't notice. But another matchup that I'll point out, especially if Mekhi Becton does miss this week, he's dealing with a concussion, right?
Yep.
Is BJ Hill on the inside. I know that Landon Dickerson is a player that I really like coming out of the draft a few years ago. Cam Jurgens playing center now, succeeding Kelsey in there. I don't know that I have a whole lot of faith in those guys in pass blocking situations, especially drop back passing situations. Not that BJ Hill is a world beater in there, but he's been very good the last couple of weeks in terms of creating disruption and doing the job of a professional at defensive tackle, which is something that the Cincinnati Bengals did not have when he was hurt for a few weeks earlier this season. So that's another matchup that I'll call out there. And James, I'm very surprised you didn't mention getting off to a fast start as well. Capitalizing perhaps instead on the Eagles' inability to get off to fast starts with the 0 points in the first quarter, something that we talk about a ton, Louis, on Locked On Bengals, because that game script is just vital so often in NFL games, and the Bengals
it's all about coaching.
Question.
And I think that's the thing. I don't know who said it. Maybe it was Dan Orlovsky. I was watching somebody say first quarter is all about coaching and the fourth quarter is all about the players. And I really think that's true, at least from Philly's standpoint. It's a direct reflection of just poor game planning throughout the week. So there's just too much talent for both of these teams to start slow. So, I mean, you would think it would open up like guns a-blazing, but that just hasn't been the case.
I think we can all agree at least that we hope the game doesn't end in a tie.
Yes. Yeah. Don't punt with 30 seconds left if you're Nick Sirianni like Doug Peterson did, or whatever the situation was.
Well, let's wrap the crossover there, guys. Appreciate it, Louis. You can find more on these games on Locked On Eagles and on Locked On Bengals. So check out whichever or both for your last thoughts going into this Sunday's game. And we appreciate you listening to this crossover Thursday on the Locked On Podcast Network.